What's good, everybody? Welcome to another episode of Over Quota. As always, please don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review if you haven't already. And of course, don't forget to tell a friend, colleague, boss, neighbor, anybody, just so we can continue to grow this podcast. Like always, my company, the J. David Group, will be sponsoring this podcast. My company helps high-growth software companies recruit top software sales leaders and salespeople. So go to the jdavidgroup.com/hiring to learn more, or go to the jdavidgroup.com/looking if you're looking for your next big challenge. Now, this is a special edition of Over Quota, during which I'll be speaking with the founder and CEO of podcast.co, which enables anyone who wants to start a podcast like this, or within another category, to launch, grow, and distribute their podcast with ease. His name's James Mulvany, who actually met on another web property that he owns called matchmaker.fm, which is kind of like Tinder for podcasters. I'll have him explain it in a minute, but it provides a platform for podcasters to find guests, which is where I found one of my guests whose name I'm drawing a blank on right now. Why? I don't know. I'll have to get back to it. And then also we can become guests and get booked on other podcasts that might be relevant for us to grow our audience. James, welcome to Over Quota.
How's it going, Jay?
I'm doing fantastic. And what the heck? I can't believe I forgot the name of the person that I met. If he's going to listen to the podcast. How the heck did you forget me? I'll get back to it and tell everybody about it in a minute. But thanks for joining me here.
No problem.
So I wanted to, let's just start there actually. Tell us a little bit about matchmaker.fm and podcast.co before we get into some of the other stuff that I want to talk about.
Sure. So over at podcast.co, we have a platform for anyone who wants to start a podcast. We make it super easy and quick to get up and running with your first episode. We handle all of the technical process of distributing it to iTunes or Apple Podcasts and Spotify and Google, etc. One-click distribution, provide all the fancy stats so you can see who's downloading it and where they're listening from, and just generally make the process really straightforward. And matchmaker.fm is a separate service, which is really, like you say, we kind of built it as the Tinder for podcasters, although it's not technically a dating app, but it's a great place for podcasters to find really interesting guests. And likewise, if you're perhaps an industry expert or entrepreneur, or you've got a story to tell and you want to become a guest on other people's podcasts, we've got a whole bunch of podcasters who are looking for interesting people to speak to, just like you. So, it's a platform basically to make connections between those two kind of groups of people.
And just to reiterate, and we'll tell it again at the end, it's matchmaker.fm and then also podcast.co. So as I was looking at your LinkedIn profile, it's fascinating that you started, at an early age as an entrepreneur.
Yeah.
Tell me about that. Where did your desire to become a business owner, entrepreneur, begin, and how old were you when you actually got the initial desire, even before you started something?
I was doing stuff at school. I remember doing lemonade stand and I don't know, selling Easter eggs or doing like some stuff like that, but really when I first became an entrepreneur was probably when I was about 16, 17 years old. I just finished high school and I had some time off over the summer. I thought to myself, well, rather than going out and getting a part-time job like a lot of my friends were doing, I wanted to see if I could make some money on the internet. And I kind of had learned Photoshop. I taught myself graphic design. I knew how to build websites So I just started picking up odd jobs I'd find online. Back then there wasn't services like Upwork or Fiverr, but I just went around forums and I said, I can do graphic design. If you need a logo making, let me know. And I kind of just started making, $20, $50 here and there, and kind of just went from there, really. I never actually had to go out and find myself a job because after that, I kind of, once I started making some money on the internet, I thought, well, this is exciting. And I kind of just threw myself into that over the next few years and ended up, I did go off to university. But, when I graduated, I built a company that was obviously generating enough revenue that it meant I didn't need to go and get a job anywhere else.
So you've never had a job?
No, never.
That's amazing. How did you teach yourself some of the web based things that you taught yourself. I mean, back then, I
Yeah.
don't think they had any online, like general assembly and those types of things back then. Where did
No.
you learn it from?
It was, there was, YouTube didn't even exist then. This was like 2003, 2004, just around the time I finished school.
Mm-hmm.
And, there were tutorial sites on the internet. So, I kind of just learned a lot by trial and error, to be honest. There were, and a few tutorials, and I used to chat to people online and they kind of give me some pointers and, and help me out and give me some ideas. And I think, really it was just a thirst for knowledge. That this is not stuff that they used to teach us in school. When you learn computers in school, they teach you how to use Microsoft Word or Excel, but they didn't teach you how to use Photoshop or how to create a website. So this was really stuff that I thought was more interesting. I found IT in school really boring. But this stuff was kind of creative. Before that, I remember when I was like 10, right, spending ages on Microsoft Paint doing like drawings and stuff, so I think that creativity was there from an early age. And I think just the concept of being able to just sit in your bedroom, use this thing called a computer to just make money from nothing was like, I remember my mum and dad just found it incredible. They were like, what? They couldn't get their head around the fact that you could just earn money from effectively nothing, like a digital environment, and then actually see it in your bank account. But I think actually the reason I wanted to become an entrepreneur was really due to my dad. My dad had lots of different jobs, when he was growing up, before, he had kids, and he always said to us, going self-employed and starting his business was the best decision he ever made, because it gave him so much more freedom than when he was in employment. And, he didn't have to answer to anyone, and he could kind of just, control his own destiny to some extent. And I think that was probably one of the reasons that I then went down that route versus sort of thinking, well, let's go and look for a job.
Yeah, it's absolutely fascinating. When you said you left college and you started I guess, to officially formulate a business when you left college, or did you do it while you were in college? I know you were making money on the side, but what was talk to me about that in terms of the...
Yeah. So I after I'd kind of, I obviously, to begin with, I was designing websites for people, or doing logos, or this, that, and the other. I was also interested in going to radio as a DJ. I loved music, and I was looking at doing that as a career around the time before I went to university when I was in college. So really what I think came about is I could see that there was an opportunity, because I actually learned how you broadcast online, how you could actually set up a, effectively DJ from your computer and send a link to someone on the other side of the world, and they could press listen, they could hear what you were saying. And I found that process really interesting. So I think rather than going into the industry, I thought to myself, well, I could probably sell a service to this industry whilst I'm still studying at university. So I set up a company called Wave Streaming, and I really didn't know what I was doing. I didn't know how to set servers up or anything like that. I kind of was just about learning to write a bit of code, but I was still very much just like designing websites, on Dreamweaver, and I wasn't particularly technically skilled at that point. So I found someone else who knew all that server side of stuff, and I kind of said to him, well, look, if I get customers in, can you help me set that up? And he said, yeah, sure. And I paid him for each customer we got. So really, then it kind of went from, rather than me doing jobs for people, we actually had a service or a product to sell. And really I started that whilst I was in sixth form college, which is the kind of like the 2-year period before you go to university here in the UK. So when I was about 17, 18 years old, went off to university. And then throughout those 4 years at uni, I kind of just grew that business into something that was, a company that was of a point where when I graduated, I probably had another year, and then I could actually start hiring staff because we were generating that much revenue.
And were people paying, how was the revenue derived? Was it monthly, or were people paying just project based? Or tell me how that worked.
People just paid us for streaming media services on a monthly basis. So the pricing was dependent on the capacity of server that they required. Most of our clients were traditional radio stations, and we had clients all over the world. Really, about half our customer base was, and probably still is now, in the USA. But it was monthly payments via credit card. So the business model, that's software as a service, as it's now called. I don't think that term really existed back then. Right. It's great because you have a dependable income every single month. You know what your costs are going to be every single month as well. And really the nature of the goal is just to grow your monthly revenue month on month. And basically that's what I did then. And I've continued to do ever since.
Amazing. The recurring revenue is always nice. And was that the company that you sold to SSL, or is that the company that you had the partnership with AOL with?
That was the company I had a partnership with AOL with wave streaming. Yeah, that kind of was just after I finished university, and that really helped me take things to the next level. I grew from it being me, and I kind of think I had at that point maybe two guys I'd employed who were working with me, to sort of being, a really profitable business. Grew it, kind of helped me scale the company really, and grew the team from kind of 2-3 people to probably 10-15 within the space of a year and a half. So it was quite significant growth. But interestingly, that deal was great. They were effectively referring us lots of free clients, and it certainly set me up really in terms of for my entrepreneurial journey. I made a lot of money in a very short space of time, and I was a very young kid still. I was only like 23. But that didn't last forever. I think it lasted like a year and a half, 2 years, and then we had to move on. And that was really the catalyst to invent radio.co and come up with that concept.
How did you get the partnership with AOL? I think a lot of the people who are listening who are sales leaders are curious about, if they're channel managers or looking for channel partners for a startup company. How did that come about? I'm
a big believer that, sometimes you can be in at the right place at the right time. So it was partly luck, They were looking for a partner to work with that was innovative in the space. We were a company that was innovating in the space. So we, one of the first couple of employees I'd taken on was a programmer, developer. So the quality of our products and the rate of which we were innovating grew drastically. And I think they spotted that and they thought, wow, these guys are moving quickly. Let's get in touch with them and see if we could work together. And really that was what caused them to get in touch with us. So I think, we didn't sort of reach out to them. It was very much like they got in touch with us, right place, right time. I was like, this is a golden opportunity. And straight away, I was like, I need to get on a plane and fly to New York and meet these guys. They didn't say to us, you need to come and see us. I was just like, I've got to get myself over there and meet them, because I think, sometimes that face-to-face meeting can help cement a deal. And sure enough, it did, and it worked really, really well. But, in terms of sales, I was still pretty naive as to sales and marketing back then. I was more still focused on the tech side of stuff, I think. Nowadays, I'm probably more driven by marketing and sales. I've not written any code now for probably 8 years, but then I was really still focused on, like the actual product side of stuff. And I still like the product side of things as well. But, you've got to have more of a holistic approach to, not just creating a great product, but actually how can you get customers on board now? Whereas back then I was just looking at like product. But that deal really did help me scale the company.
There wasn't any money exchange, right? It was just a partnership that said, we'll send you, customers essentially.
Absolutely.
Right? And then there was a revenue share in some way or another, right?
There wasn't even a revenue share. The reason they wanted to work with us is because the underlying technology which powered our platform was intellectual property which they owned. They didn't have any resource because it was a company that they'd acquired in like 1999. They hadn't done anything with it for sort of 10 years. And obviously they had a product manager who was tasked with growing it, but he had no resource. He had no development team working underneath him. So he was really struggling to grow that technology. They saw us kind of, yes, we were using this as like the core of our system, and it was free software. But we were obviously making it easier for users, consumers to actually use this. And we were building like effectively like a layer on top of this, which delivered a lot of value. So that's why they chose to work with us, because they couldn't create this kind of extra value themselves. So they were like, well, if we refer customers to these guys, they're going to take good care of them, and it will help us grow this platform out.
Got it.
Yeah.
Amazing. Can I ask what were monthly revenues? Like, what was the height, I guess, of the monthly revenues with during that period of time? And then you said it ended eventually. Why?
Yeah, so I think we went from, that's a good question. I'm trying to think of the monthly revenue. So I think I remember when I left university, I was like, we were on a way to hitting 10K a month. And that to me was like almost like unachievable. I was like, if I can just get to 10K a month in monthly revenue, that'll be amazing, because it's an extra zero. I think I was probably around 7,000 or 8,000 a month. And I struggled to get to 10K a month whilst I was still in university. But then I remember that when I first hired someone else, and it took a lot of weight off my shoulders in terms of like the day-to-day running of the company and answering customer inquiries and that kind of thing, we got to 10K in like no time at all. I think when we then got the deal with AOL, we probably went from maybe being like 15 to 20 a month, maybe to about 50 within a very short space of time, like 6 months or something. So I think almost like probably quadrupled revenue within a 6-month period.
Why did it end? You said it came to an end.
Yeah, because they sold that section of the business to another company who obviously had other plans for the product. Interestingly enough, this was now 6 years ago, and they've really done very little with it, which I find astonishing. But we got in touch with this new owner, and we said to them, do you want to continue working with us? And they of course said, no, we're not interested. Buzz off. So that was that. That deal ended, and of course we still had all the customers, but of course we weren't seeing the same level of signups that we were getting, at the peak. So business started to tail off over a period of time.
Can you tell me a little bit about the business that you did sell to SSL.com?
CDNify. Yeah. So this was, I think at the same period of time I had the AOL deal. This was a sort of another company I started. Interestingly, that's not one of the companies that's been, a considered great success. It was, we launched it. It was a slightly different market than we were in, but it was kind of leveraging our strength as a team and what we kind of learned over the past few years in terms of how we grew our company and grew the infrastructure. So it's a very technical solution for web developers and e-commerce sites to accelerate website speeds and that kind of thing. And, I probably spent about a year building this product. Obviously, when you look into how much staff wages, time, and everything cost, it was probably, I don't know, I must have invested, say, between like 80 and 100,000, in the development of it. And we struggled to make it work financially. We launched, we had customers, but it wasn't growing at a rate that it should have done. So it was a case of a couple of years later, we ran it. We kind of then switched it to like maintenance only mode. So we weren't really innovating. And then a buyer came along and said, look, we want to acquire this product. So it was a case of, yeah, sure. Probably still didn't really make very, very much money on it, but it was nice to kind of recoup some of the investment at least.
Right. And so now we mentioned podcast CO, we mentioned Matchmaker FM, and you alluded to radio. What is it? Radio CO?
Radio.co. Yeah.
Yeah. Radio.co. Are those all working in Spatico right now? Like all sort of together? Or talk to me a little bit about that.
Yeah. So we have, it's two separate companies. Radio.co is a live streaming platform for the radio industry. So it's similar service to what we offered with wave streaming. It's kind of an evolution really of wave streaming, the products we had there. Radio.co is now 5 years old. It's a pretty, mature company. It's got a very big client base. We've got about 4,500 customers all over the world. And probably about 3 years ago, we were looking at podcasting as another, a similar kind of market. It's not the same as the radio market, but it's very similar. And a lot of our radio clients want to start podcasts. So initially we thought, do we build this into the existing platform? And the more we looked at the market, we thought, well, there's actually a big opportunity here because this is a growing, an area of high growth right now. So it made more sense to spin this out as its standalone platform. And, from that, Matchmaker was launched as, again, a sub project within that business.
Why did they want to start podcasts? Tell me a little bit about the podcast industry that they saw and what they thought it could do for their radio stations and
Yeah,
business.
well, I mean, I think it's audio, isn't it? So it's a similar format. I think podcasting is kind of, it's a progression of radio. Radio has been around for 100 years, say. Now, podcasting is a digital version of radio. I think it's an evolution. You can access your favorite radio show, and you can tune in. Obviously, but 30 years ago, people would be like fixated. They'd be tuned in at 8 p.m. to listen to whatever show they wanted to listen to. They wouldn't miss that, and they'd be there every single week at 8 p.m. It's the same with TV. Now TVs have been made available on demand through different services, and obviously online and through things like YouTube. And I think podcasting is exactly the same. It's just giving consumers more choice and freedom and flexibility, as they can listen to it at any time they want.
What are some of the benefits if you're a business or, whether small business or large, that podcasting can bring you as a business?
Well, I think there's three different ways, Jay, that podcasts can be used in a corporate or a business environment. The first is, lead acquisition and sales. The second is engaging with your customers and educating people. And the third is for larger organizations, internal communications, So those are the three kind of core use cases we see podcasts being used for by businesses. And most of our clients at podcast.co are businesses or are commercially, sort of maybe like entrepreneurs or keynote speakers. So a lot of them have got kind of commercial intent behind them. It's either to grow an audience or to sort of promote a product or service. And I think, it's a great way of communicating with people. The benefit of using podcasting versus, say, video is you have people's attention for a much longer space of time. If you're posting videos to YouTube or Facebook, the window of opportunity to actually get that person's attention is very small. But if someone falls upon one of your podcast episodes, generally speaking, 75% of listeners tune in for the entire episode. I think that's the stat there. So basically, the engagement for podcasts right now, it might change in future, is very, very high. And I think, as marketers or business owners or sales guys, that's a great opportunity to have someone's attention for that length of time, is really valuable.
By the way, I heard that same stat, like 75, 80% of listeners will tune into the entire thing, which I think is fantastic. And to the point, right? Somebody was asking me about video and doing it for video, and I have them on YouTube just in case anyways, but that was the statistic that I used as well, which I think is phenomenal. You said something that I want to follow up on. You said happens to fall upon your podcast, right?
Yeah.
How do people happen to fall upon a podcast? Tell us a little bit about how to get podcasts found, if you will.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is one of the reasons, the arguments for getting guests on, and one of the reasons we created the Matchmaker platform, because if you're starting from scratch, you've got no audience, it does take a lot of work to build that audience. If you're a business, perhaps you've already got an email marketing list, or you've already got a lot of traffic on your website. It becomes a little bit easier to get some momentum and some traction on your podcast too. But ultimately as well, you need to be thinking that, it's great to just show your podcast to your existing customer base, but what about potential customers as well? So interviewing guests is a great way to get your product or service of other audiences that might not already be aware of you. So it's a case of, identifying individuals who've got interesting things to say, who perhaps aren't necessarily, direct competitors of yours. So for example, when we launched radio.co, we went and we interviewed loads of radio experts, so people who would work with on-air talent in developing their communication skills. And of course, the benefit of interviewing someone on your podcast is then they will share it with their network as well. So you're immediately pushing your brand in front of a wider audience.
I was thinking of this lately, just for my own podcast, frankly. Is there a way to, once you grab those new listeners, let's just say, right, who had not heard of you, and obviously if you do a good job with the guest and the guest is sharing something of interest, and likely the people that are new are going to be listening because they have an interest in the guest who may have shared it anyways, right? So that's inherent that they're probably going to be interested at least in that guest. how do you keep them coming back, right? Because obviously the game is to increase the downloads, and if they don't come back, then what? And I guess, and do you have any statistics on that? You might not, but like, is there data on the percentage of new listeners that will listen again, or?
That's a good question. I don't have that off the top of my head. I wish I was that. I wish I was that. Wish my mind was a database that worked like that. I mean, sure, if you go and have a look at, there's plenty of reports, out there. If you just kind of look at podcast statistics 2020 or something into Google, there's loads of really, really good quality reports now. I mean, I think you've got to try and remind people to subscribe without becoming annoying about it. There's different methods you can use. Sometimes a good way of engaging with people is just literally, by reading people's reviews out. So, like making it more personal, opening up that kind of communication between your listeners. So it feels like you're having a conversation with them, shout outs, that kind of thing can be really good. And I think it just gives listeners a perspective that you're actually aware of them, not just kind of broadcasting to them, if that makes sense. It's kind of opening up a bit of a conversation. So that's one thing. I think, again, having call to action at the end of your podcast is a great way of measuring a KPI. Again, rather than sort of nagging people just constantly for reviews, I think if you have, say, perhaps a custom URL and you give some people, give your listeners some kind of reward, it might be a free course or a download or some consultancy time with you, again, having those conversations one-on-one with your listeners, great way to kind of get some understanding of your audience. Or if you're busy, you could set them up with a member of your team. But having that call to action and sort of saying, if you hit this URL, number one, make that URL unique because that person's then come from your podcast. And number two, give them a real reason to actually want to go to this link. It's a good way of tracking your sort of measuring your success and tracking your KPI in terms of your podcasting, if you're doing it as a way to generate leads.
What about length? Because my interviews tend to go 45 minutes to an hour, only because that's just who I am, right? I'm curious, right? We just sit here and talk, and I want to learn just as much as the person listening wants to learn, right? I'm a huge I'm a consumer of podcasts, and some of my favorite podcasts are an hour plus long because they're information. But is there anything that we should glean from that in terms of length of podcast? Because maybe if people aren't willing to invest an hour of their time, they might be less likely to come back. Or what are your thoughts there?
I don't know if it's less likely to become back. I think it might be that people can't listen to it all in one go, because if you think about how consumers tune into podcasts, a lot of the time it's when they're doing tasks. So it might be they're commuting to work, or it could be that they're going for a run or in the gym, or, getting the train or on a bus or whatever. So I think sometimes it's quite rare that you'd be, doing one of those activities for an hour. But I think the sweet spot we normally suggest to people is like between 20 and 30 minutes. I don't think there's any harm in having a podcast that's sort of 45 minutes to an hour long. There are plenty out there which are that long. It's just something to bear in mind, that people listening might not always have an hour of time to devote, where a lot of the time 20 minutes, half an hour is kind of, that's a lot of people's drive to work, for example. So, I think it really varies depending on, and again, sometimes people will come back and listen to it in a second sitting as well. I think going over an hour is probably where you kind of maybe verging on being a bit, dangerous. People won't end up finishing the episode. And also you have to have people who are super engaged and sort of captivated if you want to start talking for longer than an hour, I think.
Speaking of talking directly to the audience, I guess I'll just say, guys, let me know. I want to know how, when you're listening to this podcast and it's going towards an hour, 45 minutes to an hour, do you get back in your car, on the commute home? Again, I started this podcast just before the pandemic, so nobody's been commuting anywhere anyways, or going to the gym. But do you listen to it and then pick it up later because you want to learn more about whatever the subject is, or do you just forget about it? And how are you consumed? So email me, web@thejddavidgroup.com, since I don't have a call to action yet for this, but I'm trying to do it here in real time. All right, cool. What else did you say that was interesting to me? What about the like even like the category or tagging and keywords? Like how much of that plays a role in, you know, like Apple,
Mm.
you know, putting it on new and worthy and whatever, just making it searchable? And are podcasts becoming more searchable in like Google and those sort of search engines? Tell us a little bit more about that.
I mean, my opinion is Google are going to win here. They clearly have a huge amount of computing power and an amazing search technology, which will allow them to make podcasts super discoverable. And that's been one of the main issues, I think, with podcasting over the last 20 years, 15 years since it sort of kicked off. You know,
Mm,
Apple for a long time sat as the kind of the main player in the podcasting game. There wasn't really, you know, Spotify only launched podcasting on their platform a couple of years ago. Google have only really just started innovating the space over the last year or so. So, you know, for a long time, Apple were like, yeah, we've got the lion's share of the market, but they didn't really do anything to change or update the iTunes podcast directory. Really, it's still the same now as it was in like 2010.
mm,
So I think giving context to the actual conversation is the next step forward. Whereas, of course, yeah, it's a good idea to spend some time writing some show notes or the description, and, you know, think about the title. You know, what are good people actually going to be searching for? If you just say, you know, this is an interview with James Mulvany, for example, well, there's probably not going to be a huge amount of search traffic for that. Might be some, but not loads, unless it's someone who's like super famous.
mm.
But if you can think about a kind of core question that's answered during that episode and give that a title, or even have, you know, think about it like YouTube videos. It's exactly the same on YouTube. People search questions, you know, they search for solutions to answers or solutions to problems that they have. So I think, you know, it rings true with podcasts as well, because that will allow someone to discover a single episode of yours and then hopefully get them to subscribe to your podcast as a whole. But as I say, I think the next step is going to be Google is listening to the audio, turning it into text using AI, and then giving that text, that discussion context, so it will know itself what the sort of topics that are being discussed, because Google's got all that sort of natural language stuff down to a T. And I just don't think Spotify are anywhere near having that capability yet on their platform. But the thing is with Google, they just seem to be really, you know, I just find it astonishing. They've only just started adding really podcasts into the search listings and stuff over the last year. It's like,
Mm.
you know, guys, come on, you can speed up. You can do so much of a better job of this. Surely Google of all of them could be doing better. But, you know, I think it will get there in the end, you know.
Amazing. Do you think, well, let me ask you, have podcasts started to replace blogs as or do you think that they will in terms of SEO juice?
That's a good question. I mean, you know, again, one of the benefits to being on lots of other people's podcasts is they'll link back to your website in the description, you know, so you end up with a lot of backlinks, which is great. I think there's always going to be some people who prefer to read content. You know, different people have different ways they digest information. Some people are more visual, some people like to read, and some people like to listen. You know, so I don't think, you know, you can say just a podcast is going to replace a blog. I think it should be really complementing your existing marketing strategy. But I do think most businesses now need to start thinking about having podcasts. It's still relatively uncompetitive. There's only 1 million podcasts, which, if you compare to the number of Facebook pages or Instagram accounts, is tiny. So there's still opportunity to get breakthrough there. But it's just another way to communicate with people that perhaps you should start thinking about as a company.
Before I forget, William Glass, by the way, is the person that I interviewed.
Cool.
Who, yeah, just, it was a great interview. So go back and listen to that. And now I can sleep at night knowing that William knows that I used his name. YouTube channels as well, right? I'm sure there's more than 1 million YouTube channels in comparison to podcasts as well, I'm assuming, right? How can people monetize their podcasts?
This is where it's kind of a little bit tricky still, there, because there's not one single way or one single route to monetization that, like there is with YouTube. I guess the benefit with podcasting versus YouTube is, you know, don't have to abide by one company's terms and conditions, and they, you know, you're at their mercy really once you've built an audience on someone's platform, e.g. Facebook or YouTube, and they decide to change your algorithm. It can have a big knock-on impact to your revenue or your audience. You know, podcasting, I love the fact that it's still very distributed. You know, you put your podcast up and it's available on Google, it's available on Spotify, Apple, etc. But that does make monetization tricky because it's kind of not built into a platform. Now, of course, there's different ways to approach this. If you're a business, if you're doing it for your own commercial intent, you probably don't want to be running adverts for other companies. So you need to be measuring your KPI, like I mentioned earlier, trying to get traffic from the podcast that perhaps isn't your existing customer base, and get them to go onto your website, get them to take action and try and build a marketing list from that. If you are building a podcast, you know, about a specific topic and you're looking at doing it as a commercial venture, well, sponsorship is the best way forward. And again, there are different routes to sponsorship. You know, I think a lot of people will use things like a referral link. So for example, that's why you hear Squarespace popping up on podcasts. It's a product that really kind of is a one size fits all solution. Lots of people that need to build websites, and you know, you can give squarespace.com/my name and then track how many people sign up. So there's lots of referral programs like that podcasters use. Some podcasters will actually broker deals directly with companies that they think are really relevant. I think the benefit of podcasting, if you're involved in an industry or a niche that's super focused, and you might have a smaller audience, but you know those audience, you know that audience is really engaged, they're listening to your episodes and you've got their attention, that makes any commercial message you put in front of them really effective and super valuable to advertisers. So sometimes brokering sponsorship deals directly can work as well. And then the other way is basically getting your users to fund that podcast. So a lot of podcasters will have either private podcasts that are just available to people who subscribe using services like Patreon, or they'll be encouraging donations through PayPal, or even just selling merchandise and doing things like that, or selling other products directly. So, you know, I don't think there's kind of like a one size fits all solution for making money doing podcasting. Certainly the initial trick is really getting that momentum and building an audience, and then being able to prove to potential advertisers that you have an audience. And if you can prove that that audience is not just there, but actually that they're responsive and they are relevant to the advertiser, I think that makes your podcast very valuable.
How do advertisers, I guess, quantify the relevance before they make an ad? And it's a bad question. In other words, like if I'm a podcaster, should I be targeting a certain amount of downloads that I know the audience that advertisers are going to want? Should I be targeting like a certain amount of what? Like, what's the data point that they're going to be looking at? I mean,
again, it varies, Jay. Like, it really depends on, you know, you might have a really focused podcast on a really specific industry. You know, like we saw, I don't know, someone who had a podcast about like reflective film or something that you apply to like windows or something like that. And I was like, goodness me, I was just like, I've never seen a podcast so specific, you know, but obviously you're not going to have 10,000 people downloading an episode about reflective film. But like, you know, if you've got 600 subscribers and all of those subscribers are people who work in that industry, well, surely that's worth something to someone who sells reflective, you know, film for windows. You know what I mean? Like, so I think it really depends. Whereas you could have a podcast on just sort of, I don't know, sales or marketing, and you could have, you know, 10,000 or 100,000 downloads in episodes. But they're so broad that it could be, you know, that audience isn't as valuable to an advertiser because a lot of those people might not be listening to every episode, or they might not be taking action. So I think it's a very difficult question to answer. You can't just sort of say, oh, once your podcast hits this point, it's worth this much money, because it just really depends on the content and the audience engagement. I mean, look at Joe Rogan, you know, he just sold for 100 million to Spotify. You know, it's a crazy amount of money.
Right. And that's just on the strength of his name and audience size, really, more so than anything, you know? Yeah. And by the way, if there's any sales enablement companies or people who want to get in front of my audience, you can just pretend like you didn't hear that last part about not necessarily being so engaged for sales and marketing people because
Well,
we have a niche audience here in sales and marketing, specifically technology sales. So that's our niche.
exactly. That's what I mean. If you
Right.
could, and if you could prove that those, like, if you could show that you've got an email database that's connected to that podcast, and it's not just at gmail.com addresses, for example, or at hotmail.com, and you can see that your audience is all people who are working within positions within sales and marketing, working for tech startups or whatever. That's more valuable than just saying, oh, I've got a marketing people who are interested in marketing. So it's a difficult question to answer because it really just depends on all sorts of things.
Yeah, no, that makes sense.
Yeah.
Yep, it makes sense. Just a couple more questions.
Hmm.
How often should we be publishing? Is there a minimum expectation or maximum? Give me a sense of that.
I think the key thing is to be consistent. If you're going to stick to if you're going to promise to deliver an episode every week, make sure you deliver it every week.
Mm-hmm.
Don't be sporadic about it. I think for me, once every 2 weeks is a pretty good number. I think once a week sometimes, again, it depends on your audience. There are podcasts where they have like a few episodes a week and they might be 5 or 10 minutes long, or even podcasts which are one a day. We actually did a trial of this before Christmas where we had, like a daily briefing, so you could listen to it first thing in the morning through like a smart speaker, for example. And it would just be like today's headlines about podcasting. So there's all sorts of things you can try. Again, I think it depends on the format of your show and what people expect and what you're trying to do with it. But personally, I think like once every couple of weeks.
Okay.
Yeah.
If someone wanted to get started after listening to this, what advice would you give them? And perhaps maybe if Podcast Co, Matchmaker Co could help them.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think first of all, just start actually is a good bit of advice, because there's a lot of people who think about it for far too long before just taking the plunge. You can always reiterate and change the story of your podcast as you progress. And again, the first season or your first episode is not necessarily going to be a masterpiece. And so don't beat yourself up too much if it's not great. But I think just getting started is the first thing. Try and think about your actual direction. Who is your audience going to be? Ultimately, the point of a podcast is to, either provide some kind of education or entertainment or delivering knowledge or sharing knowledge with people. So try and think about the purpose and who your audience is going to be, what sort of stuff that they might like. If you can kind of come up with a strong concept, which will make you stand out, so for example, with my podcast, I did interviews for my season 2, and I wanted to focus specifically on business leaders that were doing something differently in their industry. So they weren't necessarily just following the normal patterns of other companies in that space. So try and think of a solid sort of concept, which will help you kind of focus on what sort of guests you need to book if you're going to go down that route, or if you're going to be just maybe discussing with someone else, a co-host or a member of the team. It'll help you kind of structure the podcast. I think actually just thinking about it versus just opening your mouth and talking is sometimes a good thing to do.
I'm sorry. One other question I have, which is, what about the tools? People always wonder and ask, like, okay, well, how do I get started? Like, what tools do I need in order to get going? Does it cost me money? How much does it cost?
Yeah. Well, I mean, our sort of standard plans on podcast.co start at $29 a month. The tool, I've just done 30 podcasts within 30 days. And the tool that I've seen used most to record them is actually Zoom. I think like probably 80% of the calls I've been on have been just via Zoom. So Zoom seems to be really popular at the moment, and it's just, again, it's free to use, or it's pretty cheap if you have the paid plan, So I think Zoom's a good tool. There are other tools as well for podcasters. If you want to record interviews like Zencaster and CleanFeed, again, there's lots of resources on our podcast.co. If you go and check out the blog there, we've got lots of articles about all sorts of topics, ranging from what equipment to buy through to, what services and tools that you might want to use, through to sort of how to concept your podcast, how to get listeners and all that sort of stuff as well.
Fantastic. James Mulvany, thank you for going over quota.
Thanks, Jay. Great. Thanks for having me on. It's been great.
Absolutely. Thank you. Goodbye, everybody. Cue in the music. Be well.